Welcome back to the Analyst Architect and to a new episode of our Humanizing AI Strategy series with Tiankai Feng. Welcome back, Tiankai.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
In the previous episode, we explored competence and how professionals can build AI literacy and confidence needed to work with AI. Today, we shift into a completely different dimension, a dimension that often gets overlooked in AI conversations mainly, which is creativity. This episode is all about the collaboration between humans and machines, not as a competitors, but as co-creators. Because AI doesn't just automate tasks, it can unlock entirely new forms of imagination. So, Tiankai, let's explore this together. Usually, people are divided on this. Some believe AI will make us more creative by removing barriers and giving us new tools. Others, and these are the most of them, fear it will make us dependent on AI or even reduce our ability to think originally. So let me start with one of the biggest questions we have today. Do you think AI makes humans more creative, or does it risk diminishing creativity in the long term?
Yeah, that is a great question. I do think that for me to answer that question, I would need to break down creativity into a little bit more of a nuanced way of looking at it, right? Because we are often using creativity as a grouping for two tasks. One is the ideation task itself, right? Of coming up with a new idea and thinking of the best thing of something new that you want to have, and then turning it again into outcomes, right? Like it might be generating an actual picture, drawing it, or recording a piece of music, or writing a certain text. Those are usually the outcomes of the creativity, right? And what I think when it comes to human creativity is that surely, thanks to AI, it does help us accelerate the execution of it, right? So it does help us come up with the outcomes in a faster way because it's just very quick in doing that, right? You can just prompt a few things and just generates picture, text, videos for you very quickly. But what it does not do, I think, is actually replacing the human original ideas that we have. Because if we just from a process point of view, we are still prompting things into a Gen AI kind of model, right? And so much depends on the prompt of what our original idea is that we expect as an output of it all. And even if you want to iterate on it, you still started with an intention of what you want to have as an outcome. So what I think is that in a way, it doesn't actually take away our creativity. It maybe even amplifies it because it does not only help us to amplify our human originality by building on it, it does help us even scale it, right? Because it can generate the outputs for us much quicker if we know upfront what we want. And that is maybe a little bit too optimistic of a view, but for me, definitely the more best view to look at that human creativity is too important and it's not going to be replaced by any AI, but it does help us to turn this into reality in a much faster way. So that is really, I think, a good thing that we can do. But this having said, we should also not just be too generic about it and leave our critical thinking and originality to AI, because by definition, it's not going to be original since it's been trained with different data and by itself, it's going to just imitate the data it was trained with in a different way. So we know it's not going to be original, leaving us with, if we're actually handing it over to generate the ideas for us and we don't have any say in it, then actually none of us were creative, right? We just kind of mixed and matched things and that was it. So I hope that those that are actually creative and have originality use AI to accelerate and augment themselves.
I can see it a lot with juniors. For the experienced professionals, they understand this common sense. They have done their work without AI before. They have a lot of information in their head that AI can help them at least rephrase it or whatever the use case is. But what about juniors and fresh grads who don't have any experience in whatever the use case is? They use AI as it is. They use AI to generate ideas, to understand, to learn. Do you think there's a drawback of that?
I know what you're saying, but what juniors need to do often is to learn from best practices, right? But learning from best practices and learning from what worked before is not necessarily creative, right? It's actually a method of imitating something existing and adapting it to your own case and use case that you have. So in that way, AI is perfect for it, right? It does it much faster of actually transferring the style and format of something before into the new thing that you wanted to do. So I see it very beneficial for juniors to do it, right? As long as they also basically understand what the output is and understand what makes it a best practice or not. And the more they do it, though, right, the better I think the junior will become more creative with original ideas as well. Because the more they are seen, no matter if it's from AI generated or manually looking up things, they're going to build up their own interest and expertise, and they're going to come up with their own ideas. So later on, then they will become like the experienced professionals and can use it actually for the...
I can absolutely elevate creativity, but only if we stay intentional about how we use it.
Exactly.
I think it amplifies our imagination, but doesn't replace the spark that we have or the ideas that we have in mind. I would like to build on that idea. You make an important distinction in your book, the difference between automation and augmentation. A lot of people mix these two together, but they lead to completely different outcomes. So from your perception, what's the real difference between automation and augmentation?
Yeah, so I think the two words actually imply a very different perspective each. Because automation is really usually putting the context on a process or a task, right? Where there's an expected input and there's expected output. So either a human being is doing it or it's being automated, so a machine is doing it on your behalf. That's usually the context of it all. Augmentation is really putting the human being into the equation itself. And you look at it not from a task point of view, but from a persona point of view, right? So you put actually the whole role of someone in there, and you realize that a human being is more than just manual repetitive tasks, but they are also making good decisions, and they're also critical thinkers and have ethical standards, for example. And this is where the augmentation really then makes sense, because you're augmenting a human being that's already good in the human tasks by being now augmented, because that person can do also more thanks to the parts that AI now helps to automate. So I think that is, really the key, right? Where we talk too often about automation, actually, and automation often being sold as the part that is actually replacing human beings. But augmentation puts it in a much more realistic point of view, because it's not about actually replacing human beings. It's about replacing human tasks. But that means that human beings are being augmented and they are gaining a new productivity increase by actually keeping the human side of things on them, and they can use AI actually to accelerate.
If I can summarize that or recap, it's automation replace a task, augmentation expand the human capability.
Exactly.
Okay, so pretty much clear, because one shrinks the space for creativity and the other expand how people can augment. That's very helpful. And I think this will help leaders as well while designing AI initiatives to make sure that the human part is critical, whether I'm going to replace a human or I'm going to replace a task. It's totally different perspective.
Yeah.
Well, now let's move to a more specific and more practical topic. If we really want creativity to flourish, organizations need to design environments where humans and AI can work together, not in competition, but in partnership like we discussed before. So from your perspective, how can leaders design workspaces that truly encourage human AI co-creation?
Yeah, I think by actually enabling co-creation, as cheesy as it sounds, there needs to be some mutual respect. Just in human-to-human co-creation, right? Actually, there needs to be some healthy boundaries and a mutual respect of what each of them do well to actually come together. So when it comes to human and AI co-creation, that is, I think, the key, where we can go back to previous episodes, right? Where a human being, first of all, knows what to do and what not to do with AI. So to give it a trust of doing certain things well and knowing what tasks to not give it to, but also to be able to be the human in the loop, right? Of being able to oversee the outputs of AI and doing it the right way. And in many cases, what helps to actually make that relationship work is by defining upfront different modes of relationships that we as human beings have with AI, right? Because sometimes we treat AI as an intern, right? So we give it something to look up for me and then it comes back with a result. We double check if everything is correct and that's fine. We also sometimes treat it as a teacher, right? So like something like, tell me the most important points about this complicated aspect of it and explain it to me like I'm 5, or explain it to me like I have no idea about the topic, to actually get slowly into it. Or you treat it sometimes also maybe even as like a coach, right? When like, please critically review these things that I'm working on and give me some honest feedback if you were my coach of what I can improve on it. And it gives you some great ideas on how to actually get in the right way. All of that, I think, are different modes that we have. And we need to teach and enable our employees and team members to be intentional about the things, to use it for the right things. And then nonetheless, right, I think it needs a certain level of safety within teams to actually do it effectively too, right?
Yes.
Because in those teams, more important than ever, the people cannot see the AI as a threat. Because if the moment they see it as a threat, they're not going to interact with it. And they're going to try to insist on how important they are to actually not hand it over to AI. So by seeing it more as an augmentation, as we just said, right? And you give them as a way to improve themselves, it's a much better motivation that creates the environment for human and AI to actually co-create.
That's really powerful. And I think, like I always say to executives, people fear what they don't know. So it's all about awareness. It's all about providing them with the right context, whatever the use case is, whatever the tool is, whatever the situation is. You have to treat people as human beings, as your assets in the organization. I totally agree with you, especially the point about lowering or removing barriers to experimentation. And when people feel safe to try things, I think creativity naturally expands and augment overall. So the workspace becomes a canvas, not a control room. And this brings us to something very important from my perspective, the trap you highlight in the book. Because creativity can be enhanced by AI, but it can also be limited by AI as well, if you are not careful through using specific tools. So can you walk us through some of the creativity traps you mentioned and explain how professionals can avoid them?
Yeah. So I think one of the typical traps are underestimating the importance of having a unique tone of voice, right? So since Gen AI is really getting good right now at imitating human language, it kind of, without any proper guidance, just averages out all of the different types of texts into a very generic way of communicating, right? And while on surface it looks very formal and correct, there's something up with it because it kind of averaged everything out, right? It just kind of just used all of the human language that they learned from and now creates text for you. But in a business where, and that's often the case, where communication to customers or to employees or to collaborators and vendors is important, falling into generic communication can be really tricky because it helps you to lose all of the relationship and the unique kind of environment that you build by now having everything being mechanical and kind of bland in that way, right? So this is where I think we need to pay more attention on before we deploy any AI in an actual communication that is really moving the needle. Let's work on that tone of voice and what makes a difference between human communication and actually machine-led communication. The other side of it all, I think, is that if we don't still use human originality to generate our own text or to write our own texts, and we only rely on generically generated text from AI, then realistically saying future Gen AI models will also be trained with AI generated text. And in the field, we call that recursive training, right? That the more you actually train models with previously outputted data, the worse the quality of the output gets, right? And that actually implies that we need human originality to make AI still even relevant, because otherwise it's going to degrade so quickly that we might as well all do it manually again, because we have kind of ruined the Gen AI model by having fed it only AI-generated text. Right. So that is, I think, the other trap, how to balance actually human creativity still with AI-generated text, because by having too much AI-generated outputs and creativity outputs, we're not actually going to have ourselves as well. Those, I think, for me, the main traps.
I can relate to that. And I think last week I've read a comic where two business professionals are having ChatGPT, one to write an email and the other took the email, put it in ChatGPT, prepare a response. It's a big bong. So I get what you're coming from. And to summarize this, AI can make things a little bit easier, but also it can make it too complex.
Exactly. That's so true.
It brings us to the intentional part, and we need to be very intuitive and objective when we use that. And of course, avoid these traps to keep creativity alive out there. I would like to close this episode with something more tangible. If we can discuss a real story, Can you share an example from your own experience where AI enhanced creativity instead of replacing it?
Absolutely. I mean, I do think, right, as I mentioned before, that for the production of creative outputs is so incredibly useful and really a game changer often of what it can do. So I would say maybe in terms of documentation, right? So we all know in data management, there's a lot of documentation that's needed, right? To actually provide context and ensure certain lineage and context around what you have built. By just actually, for example, transcribing any exchange meetings and formal retros, we can use those transcriptions to then generate a formatted documentation kind of document that then doesn't have to be manually generated or very little intervened by human beings anymore to do it. And that itself, for example, for one of the data management teams that I work with, that would increase their productivity by so much, since none of us had to actually spend so much time generating documentation anymore, but they could rely on AI to do it and just double check if everything's correct, make some small tweaks. It had really moved the needle. And as someone who makes music too, right, I do think that with generative AI, I'm much faster in writing lyrics, right? And I don't let AI actually generate the lyrics, but I can ask it to please find a word that rhymes with another word quickly that makes sense in this context. And it's so much quicker than me looking it up on my own manual, for example, right? So in a way, it just removes
awesome.
my songwriting block and I can just continue being more creative, but knowing what I want as an output.
That's a perfect example, the music one. And it shows how powerful partnership between human and a machine can be insightful, and how can capability or creativity is augmented. Well, I would say creativity isn't disappearing. It's evolving, becoming more accessible, more experimental, and more collaborative. But being objective and having a specific goal is everything behind that. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And that's wrap up our today's episode from Humanizing AI Strategy. We explored how AI can elevate creativity, the difference between automation and augmentation, and how leaders can create environments where human AI co-creation becomes part of everyday work. Tiankai, thank you again for bringing this dimension to life. In the next episode, we move deeper into the organization layer, exploring AI's new operating model and how collaboration and communication shape the future of AI in the enterprise. Stay tuned and see you all in the next episode.